All right, so let's finally get into the material a little bit here. So what do you guys know about the French Revolution, if anything?
It was scary.
Okay. Can we be more specific? Do we know anything more specific than that? Than scary and bloody?
It was the French's very, very, I don't know how else to describe it other than it being their scary way to getting to a democracy, or at least halfway through.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Wasn't it like the lower class attacking the bourgeoisie for, like, slavery or something?
Yeah, essentially, like, the way France was set up, right, politically, right, you had a monarchy, and the king, technically speaking, owned all of the land in the kingdom, right? And so he had vassals, like, lords, barons, dukes, who paid homage to them, right? And he gave them land in exchange for that, right? So the class of nobles under the monarch who were quite wealthy and powerful in their own right. You also had an extremely powerful and rich Catholic Church who, apart from the king, would have been the biggest landowners in France. Now, apart from these people, you had everybody else, right? From educated professionals, right, sort of the people we would call bourgeoisie, sort of middle class or upper middle class, right, to peasants living on farms, right, to poor people living in slums in Paris, right? So society was divided up according to what was called the three estates theory, right? The church were the first estate, right? Those who pray. The monarchy were the second estate, those who fight or those who rule, right? That's to point out the origins of aristocracies in Europe in the first place, right? The original purpose of an aristocracy was to provide an elite military force, right? So knights, barons, dukes, right? These were people who were expected to give military support to a king in his wars. And then the third estate was made up of those who work, i.e., as we said, everybody else. And the third estate had very few rights, very few privileges, and basically no say in the running of the country. And in the 1770s and 1780s, the French king, Louis XVI, was talked into bankrolling a revolution in a small fledgling country across the Atlantic, mostly to spit in the eye of his rivals, the British. Right? Anything that weakened the British was considered a good thing. So this ends up bankrupting the French treasury. This, in addition to the lavish lifestyles of the French nobility. And so, in October of 1789, the citizens of Paris advance on the king's palace in Versailles, which is out in the country, well away from the poverty and misery in Paris. they demand bread, and they end up taking the king and queen prisoner and marching them back to Paris, where they are held in their Parisian residence. Right now, let's look for a second at Edmund Burke's account of this on page 190 in the anthology here. So we've got these two paragraphs on page 190. Can I get a volunteer to read, starting with history? Yeah, Ashley, go ahead.
History, who keeps a durable record of all our acts and exercises her awful censure over the proceedings of all sorts of sovereigns, will not forget either those events or the area of this liberal refinement in the intercourse of mankind. History will record that on the morning of the 6th of October, 1789, the King and Queen of France, after a day of confusion, alarm, dismay, and slaughter, lay down under the pledged security of public faith, to indulge nature in a few hours of respite, and troubled melancholy repose. From this sleep the Queen was first startled by the voice of the sentinel at her door, who cried out to her to save herself by flight, that this was the last proof of fidelity he could give, that they were upon him, and he was dead. Instantly he was cut down. A band of cruel ruffians and assassins, reeking with his blood, rushed into the chamber of the Queen and pierced with an 100 strokes of bayonets and poniards?
Poniards.
Oh, thank you.
Knives, daggers.
Poniards the bed, from whence this persecuted woman had but just time to fly almost naked, and through ways unknown to the murderers had escaped to seek refuge at the feet of a king and husband, not secure of his own life for a moment.
And we get a volunteer to read the next paragraph. Yeah, Drew, go ahead.
This king, to say no more of this queen and their infant children, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewed with scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. The next day were conducted to the capital of their kingdom, to have been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter, which was made of the gentlemen of Burke and damned exposed the king's bodyguard. These two gentlemen, with all afraid of the execution of justice, were brutally and publicly dragged to the block, beheaded in a great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, whilst the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along. Amidst the hoarse yells and shrill screams and frantic dances and infamous
Contumelies.
And all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell, in the abused shape of the vilest of women. After they had been made to taste, drop by drop, more to the bitterness of death, the slow torture of a journey of 12 miles, protracted to 6 hours, they were, under a guard, composed of those very soldiers who had thus conducted them through this famous triumph, lodged in one of the old palaces of Paris, now converted into a citadel for kings.
Okay. Thanks, Drew. Okay, so this is a pretty lurid, graphic, and terrifying scene, right? The royal bodyguards chopped to pieces by a raging mob, right? The king and queen dragged almost naked in disgrace through the streets of Paris while people dance and scream and holler and throw things at them, right? Really evocative, right? Trouble is, it's bullshit. This didn't happen. Burke invented this scene in order to horrify an English audience that was already a little bit nervous about the way things were going in France, right? In fact, one of his sources of information was a member of the Queen's bodyguard whom his son had met in Paris, right? Still very much alive. So, what Burke does, right, what Burke is about here is making a democratic revolution sound like it's doomed to take a horrifying turn before it has actually done so, right? We do know that a few years later, the French Revolution would descend into blood and violence and chaos, and would end in the dictatorship of Napoleon. Right? So the democratic dream of the original revolution does die in bloodshed. But when Burke is writing, only about a month after these events have occurred, none of this has actually happened yet. What he is trying to do here is shape the responses of an English audience to this event in France. Right? Because by and large, at the beginning of the revolution, response in Britain was positive. Not because they were big believers in, a government for the people, by the people, but again, because of international rivalries, right? This looked like it was going to weaken France, so this was a good thing, right? Chaos in France was a good thing, until it looked like it might also spread to England. And much of Burke's purpose is really about warning an upper middle class to upper class English audience about what might be coming to them if they're not careful. Right, so the meaning of the word revolution is actually changing in the late 18th century. Right, so in 1755, in Samuel Johnson's dictionary, one of the first comprehensive dictionaries of the modern English language, the word revolution is defined as a circular motion that comes back to its original point. Right, so something like the orbit of a planet would be a revolution. And in fact, there had been social movements in England before that were described as revolutions. Right, most recently, in 1688, right, the so-called Glorious Revolution, in which the Catholic King James II was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his Protestant daughter and her husband. Right, so this was framed as a restoration of the normal order of things, right? We had this Catholic king in Protestant England who was an aberration, right, an anomaly. So we kicked that guy out and we brought everything back to normal, right? That's what revolution used to mean. Things getting back to normal from a state of chaos. Revolution after the French Revolution comes to mean instead an overturning of the old order. Right, so like when we talk about a revolution now, that's usually what we think of, right? We think of a group of rebels rising up and kicking out whoever is in power, not restoring the previous state of affairs. And it's the French Revolution that sort of brings this to be, right? That sort of brings this kind of being about. Now, where does Burke seem to locate what he thinks are the natural rights of English people? The natural rights and liberties of English people. Where does he think they come from?
It would be like tradition.
Yeah. You
Ancestry.
inherit your rights from your ancestors, right? You inherit your social position from your ancestors. If we look on page 188, right? You will observe that from Magna Charta to the Declaration of Right, it has been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers, and to be transmitted to our posterity, as an estate especially belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to any other more general or prior right. By this means our Constitution preserves an unity in so great a diversity of its parts. We have an inheritable crown, an inheritable peerage, and a House of Commons and a people inheriting privileges, franchises, and liberties from a long line of ancestors. Now, do you notice anything about the style in which Burke writes? How easy is it to read these sentences?
It's not Shakespeare, but it's not.
Yeah, it's right. He writes long, complex sentences with a lot of clauses, right?
A lot of fat.
There's a lot of fat. He uses a lot of big words, like big Latin-derived words when he doesn't have to, right? Yeah.
Isn't that to like make it harder for like the average man who somehow learned how to read to really comprehend this? It's more for nobility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of that, is to sort of demonstrate what sort of audience he's writing for, right? He's writing for an educated upper to upper middle class audience primarily. So part of that is to show sort of whose side he's on, right? He's on the side of people who use words like contumely and poniard, right? So the other thing to note here is that he seems to expect that society runs a lot more smoothly if everybody just stays in their place and follows tradition. This policy appears to me to be the result of profound reflection, or rather the happy effect of following nature, which is wisdom without reflection and above it. A spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views, right? So when people desire innovation, when they want change in the political or social or cultural life of the nation, right, they want it to benefit themselves, right? Innovation is selfish. You want things you're not entitled to. To follow this up, at the bottom of page 189, sort of middle of the paragraph here, men have a right to live by that rule. They have a right to justice as between their fellows, whether their fellows are in politic function or in ordinary occupation. They have a right to the fruits of their industry and to the means of making their industry fruitful. They have a right to the acquisitions of their parents, to the nourishment and improvement of their offspring, to instruction in life and to consolation in death. Whatever each man can separately do without trespassing upon others, he has a right to do for himself, and he has a right to a fair portion of all which society, with all its combinations of skill and force, can do in his favor. In this partnership, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things. He that has but 5 shillings in the partnership has as good a right to it as he that has £500 has to his larger proportion. But he has not a right to an equal dividend in the product of the joint stock. So this is all a very lengthy and complicated way of saying, right, is that the poor have a right to what the poor are already entitled to, but they do not have a right to the possessions of their social betters, right? That everybody's rights are determined by what's been entailed to them by birth. That's the argument he's making here. You know, whatever you've inherited, Jesus. Oh, okay, no, that actually wasn't me. Okay, whoever that was, please turn that off. Okay, so people have a right to whatever they've inherited, but not to anything else, right? Not to anything beyond what has already been entailed to them. And that to desire things beyond your station in life is selfishness. Yeah, Barry.
Well, that's kind of weird, since I think he mentions that he feels the American Revolution was a good thing, in which the American ideal is you can transition.
Well, and this is again, Burke's position on the French Revolution actually surprised a lot of people, because Burke had a pretty good list of what we would now call like progressive bona fides when he wrote this piece. For example, as Barry noted, right, Burke let's get a list here of Burke's relatively progressive views, right? Burke supported the American Revolution, argued against the slave trade, argued for the rights of Catholics, of homosexuals, and colonial subjects. And yet, paradoxically, it seems, right, was not willing to support a democratic revolution in France, right?
What was Burke's social status? I mean, obviously he was some sort of scholar.
Bourgeois, upper middle class, educated. He's a lawyer. And he's actually something of an outsider in upper class English circles, mostly because he's Irish. Right? Ireland was a subject nation of Britain in the 18th century. So, despite this list of progressive opinions, there are a lot of people who argue that Burke's support for the American Revolution is not, in fact, inconsistent with his lack of support for the French Revolution. In part because the American Revolution was primarily a bourgeois revolution. It was, the leaders of the American Revolution were educated men, right? Lawyers, clergymen, gentlemen farmers, right? People of wealth and substance who were rejecting the yoke of the king, but were not otherwise attempting to overturn existing social structures. Right, in fact, this was a bit of a problem in the early republic. When we had things like the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, right, when people were expecting things to become more democratic and they didn't. So they rebelled against the new government, right? So what Burke sees as essentially like a sort of a rejection of unjust authority in the American Revolution, right? In the French Revolution, he just sees anarchy, right? Because these are people who are just kicking tradition while it's on the ground, over and over and over again until it bleeds out, right? Now, the other thing to note about Burke, I think we're going to run out of time here, so we'll continue talking about Mary Wollstonecraft next time, and then we'll also sort of go into Blake and William Wordsworth a bit, just look at poetic responses to the Revolution. But the thing to remember about Burke is that in addition to writing about political issues, right, he also wrote a very famous, very popular book on aesthetics. This is what he was best known for before his writing on the French Revolution. The book he wrote is called, and the title is really, really long because the titles of 18th century books by pompous blowhards tend to be very, very long. A Philosophical Inquiry into the nature of the sublime and the beautiful. And his primary interest in this work is to separate these two aesthetic categories from each other. Right? So the beautiful for Burke refers to objects of desire, right? Things that we see and that make us want them, right? So another person who is beautiful, right? An object that is beautiful, a beautiful small statue or a beautiful piece of jewelry, right? Something that our minds can encompass and that we sort of believe is the sort of thing that we can possess, right? The sublime, on the other hand, refers to objects of awe and terror, right? Things that our minds can't quite take in. Things that are just kind of too big or too shocking for us to handle.
Like creation, or like a religious ideology of some sort?
No, it doesn't really have anything to do with religion. It has more to do, again, with aesthetics. So, how many of you have ever seen like pictures of like those great big statues of, you know, the Pharaoh Ramesses II in Egypt, like out in the desert, and you know they're hundreds of feet high, and there's this big, you know, sort of stony, imposing, impassive face, right? Now, if you're standing next to one of those statues, right, looking up at it, the feeling it inspires is one of awe, of power and majesty, right? This is not the sort of thing that you can take home and put on your mantle, right? This is the kind of thing that makes you feel tiny and insignificant next to it, right? The sort of thing that might actually cause you a little bit of existential panic, right? Likewise, the sight of a room full of slaughtered soldiers and bloody limbs, right, would excite feelings of terror in you. Because it makes you feel weak, it makes you feel insignificant, it makes you feel powerless to do anything about this, right? So a lot of what Burke is doing is playing on his notions of the sublime and the beautiful in this particular essay. So the last thing we're going to look at, and I'll just pass out the last couple of handouts I have for you, I want to look at what he says on page 191 about, that clock doesn't work. None of the clocks in this building work. About the Queen, Marie Antoinette. And we'll leave it there, and we'll sort of think on this and come back to Mary Wollstonecraft on Thursday. Right, so can I get a volunteer to read from I Hear, and I Rejoice to Hear, page 191. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
I hear and I rejoice to hear that the great lady, the other object of the trial, has born that day. Can you read that? No?
Yeah, go ahead. You have to read the parentheses too.
One is interesting, that beings made for suffering should suffer well, that she bears all the succeeding days, that she bears an imprisonment of her husband, and her own captivity, and the exile of her friends, and the insulting adulation of addresses, and the whole weight of her accumulated wrongs, with a severe patience, and in a manner suited to her rank and race, and becoming the offspring of the sovereign distinguished for her pity and her courage. That like her she has lofty sentiments, that she feels with it the dignity of a Roman matron, that in the last extremity she will save herself from the last disgrace, that if she must fall, she will fall by no ignoble hand.
So she's being described here sort of as the scion of a noble race, right? Who, because of her blood, because of her heritage, will suffer nobly rather than ignobly, right? And if it comes to it, right, she'll kill herself rather than submit to violent treatment or rape. Okay, can I get somebody to continue from it is now 16 or 17 years? Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
It is now 16 or 17 years since I saw the Queen of France. Then the
Dauphiness, princess, yeah.
Dauphins at Versailles, and surely never lighted on this orb, which she hardly seemed to touch, a more delightful vision. I saw her just above the horizon, decorating and cheering the elevated sphere she just began to move in, glittering like a morning star, full of life and splendor and joy. Oh, what a revolution, and what an heart. How do you do the ands like that?
Yeah, well, don't worry about it.
Okay. Just weird to read. To contemplate without emotion that elevation and that fall. Little did I dream when she added titles of veneration to those of enthusiastic, distant, respectful love, that she should ever be obliged to carry the sharp antidote against disgrace concealed in that bosom. Little did I dream that I should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her in a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honor and Calvaries. I thought 10,000 swords must have leapt from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insults. But the age of chivalry is gone.
Okay, you can stop there, thank you. So, what I ask you to think about, right, particularly this passage that Barry just read out, is how this might fit into this idea of the sublime and the beautiful that Burke is already associated with. So I have a couple of things to pass out for you, right? So this is the William Blake poem I want you to read for next time. And this is the William Wordsworth poem, right? For just, don't worry about what's on this page. Just worry about the part. This is from book 10 of the Prelude, right? And if there's 2 sheets, so everybody make sure you get both sheets. And finally, I do also have my sources for today's lecture, right? So just in the interest of transparency, if you want more information about any of this stuff, these are the sources that I used. Okay, and we also have a couple of guide questions for you for next time. We'll put those up on the screen here. And you can copy them down however you want. If you want to take a picture of them, that's fine. If you want to write them down, that's fine. These are not, by the way, things that you're required to answer in writing for each class, but they are things that, if you think about them, will help you get through the reading. Okay, just things to pay attention to while you're reading. And as you go, just make sure that I get this from you, right? This information sheet that you filled out. So I just, leave that on one of the front tables. And that's it, we're done. See you on Thursday.